Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Friday night, joined by Erick Ybarra, co-host, a Roman Catholic, and also a Roman Catholic author and blogger, Mark Hausam from Where Peter Is. He's an author at wherepeteris.com and also a blogger at freethoughtforchrist.blogspot.com. Mark, it's great to have you on. How are you, sir?
Thanks. Doing well. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, sir. So let me dive in here. I am kind of curious as far as your impressions about Pope Francis. I know we haven't spoken about this before, so I'd really like to know from comes to the media. And when I mean media here, I'm especially referring to the Catholic media, but it does apply by extension to the secular media. When we look at Pope Francis and the way he's portrayed in Catholic media, and as also as far as the documents that seem to be coming from Pope Francis and also his homilies, it seems that he's portrayed in a very unorthodox fashion. Now, would you say that he is being misportrayed and in fact he is Orthodox, but maybe people with an agenda have a particular slant and spin that they're trying to put on Pope Francis? Or would you say that there probably are aberrant issues with Pope Francis? What's your impression with him?
I think that, I agree that he is portrayed very critically and negatively in some realms of Catholic media. I think there's sort of a spectrum. He's portrayed in different ways kind of across the spectrum. But I think there's definitely been a lot of criticisms of him. And I think from what I've seen, most of the criticisms that I've seen of him and his theology are not really understanding where he's coming from. They're maybe a little too simplistic. They tend to conflate things that need to be distinguished, maybe exaggerate aspects of his thought, or don't quite understand him. That's mostly what I've noticed. I think there's certain areas where there could be some criticism. I think there's a room for respectful criticism of some of his choices in terms of his prudence in saying certain things at certain times, maybe, or how he phrases certain things. But as far as his actual teaching goes, I don't see a lot of the criticisms really match up with the reality there. I would say that.
So let me ask you this, and this isn't technically a teaching per se. I can't get into some of those, but let me ask you about this. He has an audience where he's speaking to a group of individuals, and then a little boy comes up and asks him about his father who had passed away, and his father's an atheist. And Pope Francis gives, actually explicitly says, hey, he's in heaven. He had enough faith to baptize you, even though he's an atheist. He had enough faith to baptize you, so he's in heaven, and we can all pray and ask for his intercession. Now, again, that's not a magisterial declaration or anything. This was just something off the cuff that he said. But that, I think, is indicative of an individual who does not believe orthodoxy in Orthodox doctrines for somebody to say that. Would you defend that, or would you say, no, this is maybe an area that Pope Francis is lacking in?
I think that's a good example of the sort of thing that I was kind of talking about before. I don't see that there's any deviation from orthodoxy in that. I think I think he's clearly just drawing on what we've seen in Catholic theology previously, that there can be a kind of excusable ignorance. People can get confused. They can be unable to articulate or in their minds, or certain things they can have false beliefs without those being necessarily incompatible with being in a state of grace. I think we see that like in what's the name of the Vatican II document that I think it's Lumen Gentium.
Lumen Gentium, sure.
I think we see him. I don't think he's saying anything beyond what's already been said by Catholic Orthodoxy in that regard. Now we could ask questions about the prudence of, I have no problem with, saying, well, maybe was that a little simplistic, as a response to a kid, and I can understand he's talking to a kid who asked a very personal question. I'm sympathetic probably to both, people who might have some prudential criticisms of how he responded to that, as well as people who might defend him in that regard. I think there's room for legitimate questions about the prudence of how he responded, but I don't see it as a problem of orthodoxy.
So let me ask you about that, because you bring up Lumen Gentium, and that's where I was going to go with this thing, because of course in paragraphs 14 through 16 you see this discussed, and it does intimate that perhaps in some very rare circumstances with a lot of conditions, an atheist could be invincibly ignorant and could have the grace of Christ applied to him, could have faith, hope, and charity through implicit desire and a particular disposition. With all the qualifiers, it is possible. Now, it's not actually saying that this has ever happened. It's just saying it's merely a possibility. Here's where I think we're getting into a matter of aberrant theology. Not necessarily saying that, but what Pope Francis says goes beyond what Lumen Gentium says. And he doesn't just say that it is possible for an atheist under these circumstances to receive the grace of Christ. He's actually saying this individual received it due to these circumstances, but here's the kicker: we can ask for his intercession. That's nowhere in Catholic tradition, and I would say that is contrary to orthodoxy. So we do see these things. Now, I to my knowledge, he's not, putting these things in magisterial documents, but it's bad enough when he goes on, world television and says these things. So would you not say that the aspect of him communicating that we can ask for this individual's intercession is a matter of aberrant theology? Or is that within the bounds of orthodoxy?
Well, if an atheist dies in a state of grace and they go to heaven, then it's not really a stretch given Catholic theology to ask for the intercession of such a person. I mean, that's, I think, commonly practiced. Catholics often will ask for the intercession of people who have died that they have reason to think may have been in a state of grace. So that doesn't strike me as some kind of unorthodox teaching. Again, as far as did he go beyond Lumen Gentium? I mean, he obviously went beyond it in the sense that he gave a specific answer to a specific person about a specific case.
He applied it to an individual.
Yeah, and I'm of course he wouldn't. I think if he was pressed on it, he wouldn't claim to know that this boy's father is in heaven, because I mean that's not something that people can generally know. But I think so. I think we could ask. I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask a question: was that the best way to address the question with that particular boy? Again, I could see why people could argue that it was a good way of approaching it. I could certainly see some plausible criticisms of that, but I don't think that there's anything in what he said that is beyond what we see in Lumen Gentium. He's just taking that and he's kind of applying it in a very personal way, to this particular case. He knows it's possible for atheists to be saved. It can happen. Here's a little boy who comes up and says, my father was, like this. And he's obviously asking a very personal question. I think Pope Francis basically says, well, look, I'm going to assume your father was a good person because, I don't know anything about him, but you've described him in that way. And you're a little boy, coming up to me. And so I'm going to assume your father was a good person. And given that assumption, sure, he's in heaven. So, I mean, again, we can question the prudence of it, but I don't think that it's that there's anything doctrinally out of the range of what we see in Lumen Gentium.
No, I was going to say that. Can I say something real quick?
Yeah, sure.
This goes back to something we were talking about before, but that was backstage, it turns out. But before the show, we were talking about the difference between God's law, what he requires, and personal culpability. One of my concerns is that when we come to the defense of Pope Francis, we can certainly see where certain principles that he uses to reach a conclusion are not de facto heretical. So, for example, we were talking about Amoris Laetitia. What I was going to get to eventually was, if a pope was to release a document that said that Moloch worshippers, those were the worshippers of the false deity in the Old Testament times, where they would offer up child sacrifice to Moloch, if I was a pope and I issued a decree that said, offering your children to Moloch is not the ideal, it's objectively disordered, but there may be certain culpability mitigations, there may be hindrances to full responsibility, and there may be instances where you thought in your conscience you were doing what you could not do otherwise without further sin. And so I decree that in some instances, Moloch worshipers can receive Holy Communion. Now, just put a full stop on that. I didn't I didn't violate any doctrine, but I think everybody would agree with me. I mean, even the most far left would agree with me that would be kind of insane, as a decree, so what I guess Michael is getting at there, and I think I would agree with him, is that even though you can get inside the orange cones of orthodoxy, sometimes it could be such a wild idea that it borderlines on a violation of just common sense. There used to be, back in the day, censures for things that just smelled of heresy.
Sure. Yeah.
But that were not fully heretical. Like certain Jansenist principles. The Jansenists were very intelligent, and so they knew what the church was looking for in the heresy hunt. So they purposely wrote things so that it would seem as though they were in keeping with the tradition. And so certain censures and condemnations of Jansenist principles and teachings didn't run along the line of this is contrary or this is heretical outright, but this is leading towards a heretical view, or this is impious, or this is
scandalous to pious minds, that sort of thing.
Evangelistic to pious ears, right? If I was a pope and I released that Moloch worshipers can receive communion on certain conditions, I'm sure there's theological technicians that can run that through an X-ray and say, well, there's not an outright heretical principle, but I think everybody would agree in that example anyway that something's wrong there. But some defenders of like Amoris Laetitia would say, yeah, but Moloch worshiping and the realistic situation that we have today, where marriage is broken apart, the sexual revolution has marred family life in the 21st century, and so when you have a situation where a man and a woman are remarried, they had no idea it was wrong, they have 10 children now, they want to be Catholics. So Moloch worship and that situation, very different.
Pretty different, yeah.
Pretty different. But the principle I'm saying is that you can have things that are that check or pass the doctrinal exam, but still lead towards the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I would say that instance with the little boy, me personally, I was very shocked that even Pope Francis would say that. But at the same time, Lumen Gentium said it's possible, and and that right there seems to be a little bit of a problem to me, because I don't know if the church ever before Lumen Gentium ever speculated on the possibility of even an atheist being saved. To my knowledge, there was always at least the understanding that somebody was disposed and sought God And so, and the way Lumen Gentium phrases it doesn't say outright atheists. It says those who have not come to an explicit knowledge of God. So
Right,
it doesn't really, we're not really talking about like Anthony Flew before he became a deist, where he wrote articles against theism.
Yeah, not professing atheists.
Right. It's
Well,
supposed,
yeah. I mean, I think it's worded very carefully because, in any case, whether it's an atheist or somebody of a different religion, I think that the idea there. So take an atheist. Obviously, if an atheist, if we're talking about a person who understands the concept of God, they know God, they know what they're talking about, and they're rejecting him explicitly and intentionally. That's obviously incompatible with salvation. But but I could easily, conceive of a person who is maybe they sort of in their heart, in their subconscious, in their kind of at the intuitive level, they're aware there's some supreme, right and wrong, some kind of law they're supposed to follow, some being, but they've, for various reasons, they aren't able to articulate to themselves or to others. Like they maybe they've read certain arguments for the existence of God, and they've not been able to grasp them. They've gotten confused about them, and they're honest, and so they're saying, well, since I can't grasp this, I probably shouldn't claim a belief in God. I'm not convinced of the evidence that, as I understand it explicitly, so I shouldn't make that claim. So they would identify themselves an atheist or an agnostic or something, and yet at a level below that articulation, they have an attitude or a disposition towards God that is real, even though they don't know how to express that or understand that, in an articulated way in their minds. I think that's the sort of thing that Lumen Gentium has in mind there.
Yeah, that's a big contrast to, say, the Council of Chalcedon, where anybody who disagreed with, and I'm thinking of the last session where Theodoret of Cyrus, he said he agreed with the council, but that wasn't sufficient. He had to outwardly condemn Nestorius, and if he didn't, they were going to have the emperor toss him and exile him out of the state.
Yeah.
It seems as though the church used to almost be spring-loaded to assume that the outward situation was indicative of the inward situation.
I agree. Yeah.
And
I think that's well said. Yeah, I think you're right. There's been a shift of emphasis there.
But I think St. Paul did that too. I mean, like, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 5, he got word from Chloe's household in Corinth about a man who was living outwardly in in a moral relationship with his mother or his stepmother. I can't remember, but
Stepmother.
Stepmother. And in that case, the way that he expresses himself in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians is he definitely assumes that this person has no place in the kingdom of God, And I think that if Chloe were to knock on Father James Martin's door, or maybe even, a theologian at the Vatican, and say, hey, there's somebody in Corinth who's outwardly living in sin, and they're in the church, and we're going to kick them out. I think that modern theologians would say, well, it's possible that the outward situation is not indicative of ill will, but you can have a person who is in a fornicating relationship, and there's elements of that relationship which are morally praiseworthy. There are aspects of that relationship which conform to God, but there's other aspects which obviously don't. And if a church were to publicly excommunicate somebody like that, I would expect the bishops today's mindset to say, how dare you pull what St. Paul did, because you're assuming that the outward situation is indicative of evil, where this person can just be on their path to God and they're just not there yet, or they don't know the ideal, and we're all trying to find our own way. And after all, don't we all have sins of our own and skeletons in our closet? So who are we to impose upon these people? So let me be clear. I do see that the church went from assuming that the outward was indicative of the inward, but that the outward itself could be judged in light of the scandal it creates, where today we no longer think that way. We do say that there's a possibility of scandal, but it seems as though we're stretching it. We're stretching it out to all these speculative possibilities about how somebody can be outwardly against God's law, but still acceptable. And I just don't see that in the mind of Paul. I don't see that in the mind of the apostles. I don't see that in the mind of the church for so many centuries. So what do you think it is that now in the 21st century that we don't jump to assume anymore? Now we're it's almost like we go through an encyclopedic array of possibilities as to how this can be still okay,
Yeah, or at least less culpable. Yeah. I think the first thing I say is I think that's a reasonable concern. I think what you're saying is a reasonable and plausible concern that I think needs to be taken seriously and addressed. And I think it would be wrong to sort of say, oh, just shove that under the rug and don't worry about it. I think it requires a lot of very careful thinking about things. I think a few responses to that. I think one response is that we have to recognize that the church so let's start with like the idea of doctrinal development. So the church has always has this concept of a development of the implications of the revelation that's been given. And so if you look at the New Testament, you'll see certain formulations about there's certain things that the apostles say about Christ, for example, that if someone were to say today might be regarded as heretical. Like if the Father is greater than I. Jesus said that. If a Catholic bishop says, the Father is greater than the Son, he would, all kinds of responses could be made to that, or several things that are said in the Bible that now that we've been through hundreds of years of clarification and combating heresies and all sorts of things, we wouldn't say that way today, because there's been a kind of development, an awareness and articulation of the implications of some of the things that are said. And so we have to recognize that. So I think in terms of morality, some of those implications are that a greater awareness or emphasis on the fact that there is sometimes a distinction between an objectively wrong situation versus subjective culpability. I mean, you see that a little bit in the Bible, but not a whole lot. It's not certainly an emphasis. You don't really see that emphasis in the early church, as you were saying. The early councils, they seem to assume that if somebody goes wrong, they're culpable pretty much.
Even after death.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that there's that kind of assumption. I mean, no one ever comes out and says there's always an exact equivalence between objective guilt and subjective culpability. We're defining this as a teaching of the church that there isn't a distinction between these things. You don't see people defining that position. It's just kind of assumed. It's just the way people think. And as the church goes on later on, you see it's not until quite a bit later that you start to get more of an understanding or emphasis on that.
So let me ask this. Is it the case that Paul should have made some of these distinctions morally? That he should have said, wait, the exterior is not necessarily indicative of the interior, and there could be a mitigation of culpability. Therefore, we do not necessarily need to cast this man out and turn him over to Satan so that his soul would be healed or would be saved before the day of destruction and so on. But we need to be merciful and understanding and recognize that there's a mitigation here to this due to this and that circumstance. So he can still continue to sleep with his stepmom, but we're not going to say it's okay, but we're not going to excommunicate him too, because we're using these necessary distinctions that have developed later on through the development of doctrine. So is it not the case that what we're basically saying is Paul should have made those distinctions, but he failed to?
No, I think that we shouldn't evaluate someone in one set of circumstances necessarily by people in other sets of circumstances. We wouldn't evaluate New Testament writers on the basis of 21st century level of development in the church.
Fair enough. But
I would also add. I would also add, I think there's some other things we have to consider here too. So another thing is that we have to take this on a case-by-case basis. So it's not even in any particular age, we don't always respond the same way to every particular circumstance.
Sure.
We don't know all the details of the particular case in Corinthians, for example.
But here's the difference. And I totally agree with you. Absolutely. Every case is different. But here's the difference. In Scripture, they never give us a situation in which that is done. Whereas today, it's always that we have these exceptions and distinctions that are made. And it's never or very rare that we actually exercise the discipline that's in the New Testament. So it's not necessarily the case that, okay, well, we're failing to make some distinctions between individuals here. I think the problem is we have an entirely different orientation. They were completely in a different direction, and we're all the way on the other end of the spectrum. Would you not agree that that's the case?
I think that there is a significant difference in emphasis. I think you see hints of this in the New Testament, but you're right. Like what I think of Apollos, for example, in the book of Acts, who is, he's not teaching quite, the adequate doctrine, but he's kind of seems to be trying to do the right thing. They call him aside and they correct him, and they treat him very differently, for example, than they do someone who's
Simon.
Yeah, exactly. Or you see, sometimes Paul in his letters talks about heretics as being very, self-condemned, seems to think of them as being on their way to hell. Other times he talks about people who you correct, but you don't treat as an enemy, but you treat it as a brother. He uses, even within the New Testament, you see different language sometimes used a little bit differently. But there certainly is an emphasis shift that's occurring. There's no doubt that the emphasis in the New Testament and the early church is far more on not making a distinction between subjective culpability and objective state, or at least that's just not really brought out that much, whereas today it's brought out a lot. I think there's a number of things that can account for that. I think doctrinal development is one thing that can account for that. I think also, I don't think that that we have to be committed to saying necessarily that we haven't gone too far on the other side. I'm willing to grant that there can be, that perhaps we have gotten a little wishy-washy on certain things. I don't think that criticism is necessarily a problem, or what would take Amoris Laetitia. I think we can say, well, what is Pope Francis asking of us there? Well, he's requiring a certain pastoral response to these people in these objectively wrong marriage situations. Is he requiring everybody to say this is necessarily? Is it possible to say, well, are we sure we're not going too far that way? Maybe we need to be concerned about holding people accountable more. I don't think Pope Francis is necessarily saying you can't raise that concern, although you can't oppose the pastoral practice. You can't. That's a mandate from the Pope, so you can't say, well, this is illegal, we're not going to do this. We have to follow the Pope's instruction. But in that case, it's more of a instruction than a particular doctrine. Although I do think that Amoris Laetitia does teach us that we need to be open to those kinds of circumstances and to be careful how we judge.
Okay, so let me ask you this, maybe shift the gears just slightly. I could ask you about particular documents all day long. Let me maybe just back it up and ask you just, broad perspectives here. Is it possible for the Pope to err? Now, of course, we would all say, okay, he can't err in his extraordinary magisterium. I get that. What I'm saying is it possible for him to err in his non-extraordinary magisterium, his ordinary magisterium?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad I think that's a good place for the conversation to go, because I think our examination of what is reasonable and plausible in terms of things like the development of emphases in the church depends an awful lot on our view of the authority of the church. I would, if someone asked me, and if I didn't have any instruction from a divinely guided source as to what we should do with regard to people in irregular marriage unions, I wouldn't have the slightest clue, what to say. I'm glad I'm not the Pope. I mean, I wouldn't know how to respond to that. But I'm sympathetic. I want to follow what Pope Francis leads, because I have a belief that he has this divine guidance in what he's doing. So my answer to the question would be that it seems to me the church has taught pretty clearly that there is a divine guidance in all magisterial teaching, all authoritative papal teaching. There's a distinction between definitive and non-definitive teaching that we see. Yeah. So there's times when the Pope will make a definitive statement. So, like for example, with women, whether women can be priests, that's been crystal clear, decided in a definitive manner. Women will never be priests. That's that's an unchangeable thing. And Pope Francis himself has reiterated that a couple of times at least.
But you have the CDF saying that you talk about what is reformable and irreformable, definitive, non-definitive. You have the CDF saying that even those things that are not definitive, although ordinarily they are true, some of them can be overturned later on. And this is why they're not definitive, because they're not necessarily true, not necessarily infallible. So if there are some things that are non-definitive, and there are some things that are non-definitive that can be overturned, wouldn't that mean that the Pope can err in his ordinary magisterium?
So what I see the church teaching on this subject, and it's been reiterated several times, so I think it's fairly clear, is that the non-definitive teaching of the church is reliable as far as it goes, but it's not intended to be definitive. So if the Pope teaches something non-definitively, we are to accept it to the extent that he intends to teach it. Lumen Gentium and puts it, describes it as we have to submit to his according to his manifest mind and will, which is expressed in the nature of the documents, the verbal expression. And they mention several sort of, not meant to, I think, be an exhaustive list, but just saying you look at the context of what he said, and to the extent that he intends it to be a teaching that goes out to the whole church and binds people, then that's something that we are required to submit to. And I
get that
it's reliable insofar as it's intended to go. So I think we have to avoid two extremes there. We have to avoid saying, well, treating non-definitive teaching as if it's definitive.
Right.
So non-definitive teaching isn't definitive, which means that, as you said, it has a provisionality about it potentially. It could be augmented or even corrected in light of future information. So it might be we might be required to submit to it at this time, but we're not required to submit to the idea that it won't be augmented or altered based on changing circumstances in the future. So that's one extreme we want to avoid. But I think we also have to avoid the other extreme of saying that non-definitive teaching is therefore can lead people into error, can lead people into it can be something we have to rebel against or resist. What I see the church's teaching is that we are required to submit in mind and will to that teaching insofar as it is intended to bind us, because as far as that intention goes, it has the authority of Christ, it has the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and it is reliable. So we're never going to be led into embracing something that we shouldn't embrace by it. We may be led to embrace something that is the right thing to embrace now, but might be not embraced in the future, or it might be augmented in the future.
Okay.
But we're never told to embrace something that we ought to reject or rebel against.
So in your estimation, there's never a case. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, it undercuts the entire purpose of the papal authority, which is to be the guarantor of orthodoxy, the guarantor of the unity of the church, so that we can be united together and in the orthodox truth and prevented from falling into error.
So there's never a case that perhaps the ordinary magisterium, or even the extraordinary magisterium, has been contradicted by a lower level ordinary magisterial teaching of the Pope. Can't happen and has never happened in your estimation, correct?
Yeah, I mean, like if you're thinking of a situation where something's been definitively defined.
No, that's not what I'm referencing. Not something that has been definitively taught by the extraordinary or ordinary and universal magisterium. I'm talking about something that has been taught with a greater force or greater level that is non-definitive, or you could even throw in something that has been taught definitively through the ordinary and universal magisterium, for example, but then was contradicted by a very lower level teaching by the Pope in his ordinary magisterium. That can't happen, in your opinion.
If you have an earlier non-definitive teaching, then there is a potential for later teaching to push that in a different direction, given that it's inherently, the earlier teaching was non-definitive. But
if that earlier teaching had a greater theological weight, is what I'm saying. Obviously, you would have to go with what the earlier teachings has, if it has a greater theological and dogmatic weight or doctrinal weight, than something lower level with a lower weight by a pope.
I don't see that idea anywhere in what the church has taught. The idea of this. You go with you try to figure out what's a higher or a lower, and then you can rebel against lower order teachings. What I see is that what the church says is we are bound to submit in mind and will to everything that the magisterium teaches according to the manifest mind and will. So that is to the extent that it's intending to bind us, to the form and extent it's intending to bind us, we are bound to it. So I don't think we ever have a right to say, well, an earlier pope, wrote an encyclical and said this, and now a new, the recent pope has written, an apostolic exhortation or something, and said something the opposite. Both are intended as binding, but I can rebel against the later one because of the earlier one. I don't see anything that doesn't seem to me at all what the church teaches about the nature of its authority. But we're not allowed to. There's nowhere where the church says you're allowed to investigate the teaching of the magisterium according to your own private judgment, and then even against the intention of the magisterial teacher, you're free to rebel against it if it contradicts what you've discovered based on your own private judgment. I don't see any place in the church that's taught that.
What about the CDF's document on the vocation of the theologian that says exactly that?
I don't think it does. I mean, we'd have to look at it specifically. If you want to see, want to see my take on that, I mean, I've written an article called "The Unfailing Reliability of the Ordinary Magisterium." And in that, I examine the Donum Veritatis, the one you're referring to, quite a bit. And I know some people have tried to use it in that way, but I think if you look at it, it doesn't. It does talk about situations where people might. It does talk about how there are circumstances where the magisterium allows a certain degree of criticism, but
it also says that the theologian can reserve assent, giving submission of religious submission of intellect and will. He can reserve it in some extraordinary cases, which would mean that individual, that theologian, is given the permission to withdraw assent in certain cases when there appears to be a contradiction between two magisterial teachings.
I don't see that in that document. What I see is a couple of things that could superficially sound that way. One would be that it does talk about there are certain things, magisterial teachings that are non-definitive are sometimes bound up with some things that are binding and some things that maybe are distinct to a particular place and time, and there can be legitimate room. Maybe the magisterium doesn't intend to bind to everything, every aspect of it. So, like for example, in an encyclical letter, you might have teaching in there that is obviously expect everybody to hold, and other things maybe that are less central to the thrust of the document. That are maybe comments that are in there where from the context it's clear that the Pope doesn't intend everybody necessarily have to agree with it, right? So in other words, there are situations where the magisterium itself allows a range of criticism, and that's acceptable. And then the other thing in Donum Veritatis that could sound like it's allowing dissent in certain contexts would be, it talks about theologians who find themselves in their conscience having trouble submitting to certain non-definitive teachings. And it talks about how, well, they ought to submit to those teachings, but perhaps they find themselves in a situation where they just can't bring themselves to do so. And it talks about, well, at the very least, they should try to not, foment movements of dissent. They should not broadcast their views widely. They should try to remain in dialogue with the church. They should try to be open to being corrected and all that sort of thing. I don't think that it's not saying they are allowed to refuse submission. It's saying they are required to submit as far as they can, but if they can't, then it's kind of a way of saying, well, yeah, this is a difficult situation. Let's be merciful to them. I actually see it as kind of ironically parallel to what Francis is saying in Amoris Laetitia, in that, ideally people ought not to be involved in irregular marriage unions, but there are people who are in those unions and are confused about what they should do, and the church is trying to be merciful to them. It's not saying, oh, it's okay for you to be here, but it's saying, I can see how you are confused about what you should do, and there's pastoral advice in terms of how to kind of accompany these people to come along further. I actually see that as parallel to what Donum Veritatis is saying about dissenting theologians.
So the ordinary magisterium, however, or the magisterium just in general, period, has never contradicted itself in any way. Would you agree to that or disagree?
I would agree that it's never contradicted itself in the sense that you're not bound to contradictory thing. I mean, you can have
in a non-definitive way. Has the magisterium ever contradicted itself in a non-definitive way?
If you have an earlier non-definitive teaching, it can be corrected by later teaching. If you wanted to use the word contradiction for that, I wouldn't see that as being an impossibility. But I probably would prefer to say that because the earlier teaching was non-definitive, it wasn't intending to rule out later augmentations, and so there's no contradiction in that sense. Like, there's never a time when somebody is required to believe something that is not true. So I can be required to believe something provisionally, like I can be required to believe something that might turn out later to need correction, but I would know that because the teaching is non-definitive. I'm never required. The church never requires me to believe something where I look back and I say, oh, I was misled. I was led into error. I was led into holding something I ought not to have held at that time.
So when Pope Honorius writes to Sergius and says what he did, the people who were reading that at the time, they would not have been led into something that was aberrant in theology.
Not in the sense of what he actually taught. Now, I think we can make a distinction between what Honorius taught versus the way he expressed himself, which did lead itself to confusion. I mean, he was condemned for that by the council and by later popes. I mean, in my take on the Honorius case is that he was not a monothelite. He did not intend to teach monothelitism. Sure. He was responding to a question from Sergius that Sergius phrased the question as if it as if the issue was about whether Christ had two contradictory wills. And Honorius was very concerned to avoid saying he had contradictory wills. And so he said, well, we need to say there's one will. Then later on, after that, you get the development of the monothelite position, which becomes more, the heresy gets defined more clearly. After that point, you see all the popes very clearly on the dialethelite side. I don't think he taught error, but he has been criticized for teaching, for not being adequately careful enough in terms of his response to Sergius. He spoke in such a way as to give an impression that lent weight or lent motivation or kind of helped the monothelite heresy develop.
Right, I'm familiar, but then later on, the papal oath actually required the individuals to affirm that he was a heretic. So that has to do with more than just negligence. That has to do with false doctrine. So I think there might be some issues there, but without necessarily getting into bogged down into Honorius, what I guess I'm getting at is this: in a non-definitive way, has the ordinary magisterium ever contradicted itself in another non-definitive ordinary magisterial teaching? I think the answer is yes. But I think what you're saying is no, it can't do that. But I'm wanting to make sure that that's what you're saying, because I'm still not very clear on that.
Okay. There's nuances here that are sometimes difficult to articulate, but basically if you have a non-definitive teaching, it's not going to lead into error. So I'm not going to be led to be thinking that something is definitive that's not, for example. I might be led to a provisional conclusion, which might be augmented later on. So there could be, I have no problem with the idea. I don't think the church has any problem with the idea that there could be times in which there's maybe an earlier non-definitive teaching that is corrected by a later teaching, in the sense that the earlier teaching maybe came to a conclusion but didn't require that there wouldn't be an augmentation later on, and then later there is an augmentation and there's a change. I don't think that's a problem I don't think that's excluded.
Yeah, but that's not exactly what I'm getting at, because the case of usury, for example, you have something taught by the magisterial authorities, then you have something taught contrary to it by the magisterial authorities, namely that usury is not objectively wrong in every case, or at least we're redefining how we understand usury. So there is a difference there, and it does contradict each other. And we can at least for now agree that this was on a non-definitive level. We'll set aside the argument that some would say it's on a definitive level. We'll put that to the side. Wouldn't that not be an example of where the magisterial authorities contradicted itself in a non-definitive way? Yes, maybe they're not requiring the individual to believe it in a definitive way, although I think that they probably were. Let's assume for the moment that they weren't. Is that not an example?
With the case of usury, my understanding from my own research of that is that, what we basically have is kind of a further clarifications about what we're talking about. I think the church later came to make some distinctions in terms of different ways in which somebody might, have interest on a loan or something like that. And they came to clarify that there are certain things there's certain principles that are typically associated with the concept of usury that are bad, and would still
here's the difference. The ordinary or the magisterial authorities taught that interest on loans is never permitted and is sinful, and later on it's said, okay, it's now permitted in some cases and it's not sinful. We just can't get excessive with it. There is a contradiction there, is there not?
From what I've seen, that's not how I would express it. What I see is kind of a general prohibition on usury earlier, and then later more nuanced reflection that makes distinctions. It's not like those distinctions were recognized earlier and rejected. It's that they just really weren't made until later. So I see it more as a matter of...
It wasn't an issue of not making the distinction.
Let me give an analogy. Like in the book of Genesis, in the story of Noah, you have God telling Noah, I want you to bring a pair of every animal on the ark, two of every animal. And then later on, I believe in the same chapter, if I recall, he says, well, I want you to bring 2 of every, was it unclean animal and 7 of every clean animal. And some people would say, well, that's a contradiction, because before he just said 2 of every animal, and then later on he says 2 of some kind and 7 of another kind. But I remember in responding to that criticism, it's always been evident to me that what you have simply there is not a contradiction, but simply a clarification of a nuance that wasn't made earlier. Right?
But
So
the fathers were rejecting any kind of clarification. I get what you're saying, and that's totally legitimate. But what the fathers were saying denies that there is a possibility for any clarification. They deny that there's a possibility for any kind of revamping of this by outright denying any possible use of interest on a loan. So to me, that's not necessarily an example of a case where you can clarify it.
It might be the case that the practice was more, had a more general outlawing. It was more general in terms of what it outlawed, and the practice is altered based on further reflection on some nuances in the idea of it. I don't see that as a contradiction of teaching so much as a clarification, which led to a more nuanced practice as well. But I think the underlying point, though, is in any of this is what I want to say, what I think the church says pretty clearly, is that even in the ordinary non-definitive magisterium, you are not going to be led to embrace something that you shouldn't embrace. You're not going to be led to take a position that you ought to reject in order to stand up for orthodoxy. So there's never a case in which we ought not to submit mind and will to the ordinary magisterium to the extent and in the form that it intends to bind us. That's what I think the church is pretty clear on. You never have a situation where the church says, we want you to submit to this, and you say, no, I won't. I'm going to stand up for orthodoxy by rebelling against the magisterium. I don't think that's ever permitted in the church's teaching of its reliability. I think if we take that line of thinking, we're going to run into some very serious problems. Not only I think are we contradicting how the church understands its own authority and has expressed it, but I think if we take that to its logical conclusion, it's going to be difficult to justify trusting the church in anything. Because as soon as we say, well, I know you say I should think this, magisterium, but I disagree. I'm going to reject what you bind me to based on my own private judgment, and I think I ought to embrace the opposite to defend the truth. Then would I trust the church in any area? So if the church says, here's a non-definitive teaching, you're bound to it. You need to submit with will and intellect. And I say, I know you think that I ought to submit to that, but you're wrong. Based on my private judgment, I think I ought to take the opposite position. Then how am I going to trust the church when it says, here's a definitive teaching, like the Immaculate Conception. You need to accept it as definitive. It seems like if I've already said I can rebel against what the church tells me I ought to think, then it's difficult for me to see any basis for not.
Fair enough.
Well, how do I know you're right? If you're not right in telling me this, then how I know you're right in telling me this? There's got to be a general trustworthiness of the magisterium.
I get that, and I think that's fair. But what I would say is the individual can say ordinarily the ordinary magisterium is right, but in some exceptional cases it could have something in there that isn't. So one isn't to say yes in every case. I'm supposed to question the church now. No, ordinarily one can trust it. But it would seem that there have been some instances in which there have been some problems that crept in. But I know you would disagree with that. But I'm just kind of clarifying where I'm coming from. I'm not saying the individual should just necessarily question everything.
Sure, of course.
I think there is a general reliability there, even in the ordinary magisterium. And I think there is a general protection of the Holy Spirit in the ordinary magisterium. I just wouldn't say that there is always reliability and always a protection by the Holy Spirit. I think that's where we would get into an equally problematic situation. But I know you would disagree, and that's okay. Yeah. Eric, I don't mean to hog Mark here. If you want to jump in here too.
Yeah. So, we've been talking a little. We've been talking a lot about the nuances of magisterium. The death penalty is a subject where many people today. They really just don't have any patience for these distinctions anymore. For them, Pope Francis's revision on paragraph 2267 of the Catechism constitutes a clear departure and contradiction with the past. and they would argue along the lines of, it used to be believed that for the sake of justice and the expiation of it, of guilt, that a certain heinous criminal could be put to death as a punishment by the state, irrespective per se of the protection that it guarantees society, even though a punishment in and of itself is a service to the common good. They would say that this expiatory, what's the word? Expiatory, yeah. The expiation of guilt, or the expiation of justice, that justice would be a fitting consequence.
Retributive justice, basically, right?
Retributive justice, yeah. It seems as though John Paul II was already in this current where he didn't really see that. He saw a justification for the death penalty almost exclusively on its on its utility to safeguard the common good. But if you could safeguard the common good through a non-lethal, bloodless way, he would say it's immoral to take the life of a criminal. Benedict XVI appears to back that up. And I think Pope Francis just went, all the way with it and just basically went for the abolition of death penalty. But there are critics out there who would say that all three of them are forgetting this, the idea of the expiation and the retributive justice aspect, and that it used to be believed that if you committed a serious enough offense, it could be a fitting punishment just for the sake of retributive justice to take the life of that individual as a fitting penalty to the crime. So would you say that this is, number one, an outright heresy that St. John Paul II started to teach and now has been sealed in Pope Francis? Or would you say that this is continuous with the prior, magisterium? And how would it be continuous?
I think that you're right in pointing out that the real shift in emphasis is at John Paul II rather than Pope Francis. I think sometimes that's lost on people. It seems like people weren't really concerned about this until Pope Francis's change in it. When they really, if they were going to be concerned about that, they should have been concerned with Evangelium Vitae earlier, because I agree, that seems to be Pope Francis just basically. But John Paul II said, well, unless there's a need for protection, then it's inadmissible, and it's almost always probably the case that it's inadmissible. Maybe there's possibly some case where it's admissible. All Pope Francis did is just said, nope, there's not any case where it's admissible today. He just kind of just took it to just made a very, very small step, I think, relatively, even though it had a practical effect on what people did. But of course, I do think there's a change in emphasis. I don't see, from what I've seen, I don't see necessarily a rejection of the concept that justice has a retributory element to it. If I recall, I think the Catechism still talks about punishment as being a kind of how's it put it, kind of make up for the disorder caused by the offense.
Of the moral disorder.
And I hear a sort of retributory sort of language there. This is addressing a moral disorder. So punishment has more than just a totally pragmatic effect of protecting people from getting killed or something like that.
You're right. There's still even today in the Catechism, the way we have it after the revision, there is still supported retributive justice. But the limit would be a lethal instrument,
So I think I don't think that part's been repudiated. I think that what John Paul II did is he basically said that unless you have that basically the retributory element is not in itself sufficient to warrant the death penalty. That is, it might be a good reason, it might be an important aspect of it. If you're going to have the death penalty or any punishment, it's going to have this kind of retributory element, but it doesn't necessarily follow from that that's the only concern or the only factor in terms of whether we have the death penalty. I think everybody probably agree with that to some degree. There's always situations where circumstances might require different kinds of punishments. And the mere fact that something would have the effect of, of contributing towards righting a disorder isn't necessarily a good reason to carry out that punishment if it would have other deleterious or effects on the common good, on the society. I think what I see John Paul II is saying is that for all kinds of reasons, maybe a greater awareness of the dignity of criminals, a greater emphasis on that, just kind of thinking through the implications of the death penalty a little more. Also, perhaps just the circumstances of modern times, both in terms of the ability to protect people from criminals, as well as probably a lot of other shifts in terms of how we as a society understand crime and punishment. For a whole host of reasons, I think John Paul II is saying that it would not be appropriate to put someone to death merely on the basis of a retributory concern. There would also have to be a need of protection of society in that. Then Pope Francis simply, takes it the next step and says, it is not necessary for the protection of society to do this. We are able in modern societies to find better ways of accomplishing that protection than the death penalty. So I see it as a change. I see John Paul's teaching as a change in emphasis. I see it as an application of the principles of justice to that exist in modern times. I don't see it as, at least I've not been able to see that it really contradicts anything that came before. There would be a contradiction if we had somebody, maybe before saying, even if there was a need for protection of society, and even if it would in other ways be problematic to the common good, just purely because there's a retributory element there, the death penalty is the right thing to do. If somebody said that in Catholic teaching, I think that would be very difficult to reconcile with what modern popes have taught. But I think rather what we see is, kind of just the assumption that the death penalty is necessary for the common good, that it is necessary for protection, that it is on the whole helpful to the common good, and that it has this retributory element, and therefore it is permissible if it's done lawfully and if it's necessary and so on.
Yeah,
I see that. Yeah.
I think in my own studies on this subject, I went back into the historic, at least the magisterial treatment that even comes close to dealing with the death penalty. It always seems to be speaking towards the common good in addition to the issue of retributive justice.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well.
Right, exactly. So, I agree with you. I think that for those who would want to say that Pope Francis has really contradicted the Church's prior teaching on this, they have to find a prior teaching which says that irrespective of the safety to the common good and for the sole cause of expiating justice, a criminal can be punished with the death penalty just alone for retributive justice, and that is a good thing. That's a praiseworthy thing. So I haven't seen that either. So hopefully somebody can send that our way. I know Ed Fazer and one of his colleagues wrote a book. I haven't read it yet. It's just so many books to read. But okay, so that kind of answers that. So it seems to me like we've just, in my opinion here, we've gotten really soft in comparison to where the church used to be. On the issue of heresy, orthodoxy, discipline, moral moral teaching. It seems as though without technically violating doctrine, the code of doctrine, we've gotten very, very soft to the point where outsiders don't know what we believe anymore. Insiders don't know what we believe anymore. They see one thing here, they see another thing elsewhere. And I think you said that this is a valid concern, that needs to, so when it comes to Pope Francis in particular, though, I think it's getting really difficult to continue defending him, especially in light of what happened in Rome recently with the Amazon Synod, where this is public information. So this is not really something that, is happening behind the scenes where where it's gossip. But, you have St. Paul, through the inspiration.
Before we go into this too much, I'm actually getting close to the end of my time that I'm able to.
Yeah.
Would there be a possibility of continuing this discussion?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. We can definitely do a part 2.
I'm finding it very interesting, but I'm also looking at the
Sure.
clock, and I'm seeing I'm getting to a point where I'm going to have to cut off for now.
No, I think your input here was valuable. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing what you had to say. And so if we have to cut it, if you want to take a question or so, or no, that we should probably cut it off.
I haven't asked yet, so I don't
Well, how
have.
about you and I can stay on? You and I can stay on, but if we want to, give greetings and goodbyes to Mark.
Yeah, Mark, if you will, go ahead and put in a plug for your stuff. I know I already, put the plug for your free thought for Christ.blogspot.com and also where peteris.com. But any other plugs that you want to put in? Of course, we're going to have a part 2 whenever you're available, but anything that you want to throw out right now, go ahead.
No, I think what you said is good. I appreciate your mentioning those things and for the invitation to be on as well. Very interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it. I appreciate you coming on and engaging in this conversation. I would love to do it again whenever you're available. Let's pick it up and talk about maybe the Amazon Synod and some other questions, and then we could do the live chat questions the next time.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll talk to you off the air, and we'll see when we can do it.
All right. Thank you.
All right,
okay. Take care, Mark.
Good night.
Everybody, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, share this material on your social media, and God bless you all. Until next time, go share your faith.